All right, welcome everybody today to this Clean Power Plan webinar put on by the Ohio Environmental Council. My name is Brennan Howell. I'm the Director of Clean Energy and Climate Campaigns. I have with me here today my colleague Hannah Tyler, the Director of Marketing and Communications, and we'll be taking you through this today. Now, before we get started, I just want to say I will be taking questions throughout. So if you want to ask any questions, type them into the chat box and we'll sort of answer them, certainly at certain pre-designated times that I will, or throughout. But either way, if you have any questions, type them in the chat box. Also, if you have any technical issues, if we drop out, if we can't hear me, or if I'm not speaking clearly, type that in the chat box and we'll try to troubleshoot that on our end. All right, well, here we go. Certainly some people may join on while we go through, but this is the Clean Power Plan webinar. Now, the Clean Power Plan, sometimes people will refer to it as 111D, as the carbon pollution standards. But regardless of what label they attach to it, this is the biggest, most aggressive carbon reduction plan that has ever been proposed. Even though the specifics of the plan have not been finalized, it has already encouraged China to sign an agreement with the USA to jointly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and has encouraged India to take substantial action to reduce their own respective carbon pollution output. Previously, opponents of CO2 regulations have pointed to the unlikelihood that China or India would ever agree to reduce their respective CO2 emissions. So this proposed rule has already proved them wrong. This plan will also likely play a key part in ensuring that all countries agree to carbon reduction goals at the upcoming International Climate Change Conference in Paris this December. Now, my general intention with this is to give you an outline of the major points of the plan. While it's not as confusing as certain people would like to portray it as, it is a bit complicated and worth understanding the major points of. So as I've said, if there are any questions about anything I say during the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we'll answer them throughout the webinar. Now, before we even start on precisely what the Clean Power Plan is, we should address precisely why it is so important and why it is happening at this moment. Oh, sorry, hold on. Sorry, you have to hold on a moment. We're going to have to redo some things with our slides. We're bouncing over real quick. This will not be how fast our actual presentation goes, but we just need to get it set up. I apologize for this. All right, sorry about that. Now that we're back. All right, like I said, now getting into the why the Clean Power Plan is so important for Ohio and is so important in general. Well, specifically in regards to Ohio, this won't come as a surprise to many of you, but Ohio is a very dirty electricity sector. 66% of our power comes from coal. As far as CO2 emissions alone, we have the fourth highest CO2 emissions of any electricity sector of any state in the country. If Ohio was an actual state, we'd be in the top 20 in terms of energy consumption. So not only is Ohio an energy hog, it's a dirty energy hog. So really, reductions in Ohio under the Clean Power Plan are going to be very important, specifically for this next reason. If Ohio can reach its CO2 reduction goals under the Clean Power Plan, then the USA will be able to reach its overall greenhouse gas reduction goals. And if the USA can reach its overall greenhouse gas reductions, then all the international greenhouse gas reduction agreements, including the recent one with China, that are predicated on the USA making a certain amount of greenhouse gas reductions, will be successful. So really, Ohio's contributions to CO2 reduction are going to be huge just because it's such a big CO2 producer. Now, some people in Ohio specifically, in trying to argue against the rule, have certainly said, well, the emissions from Ohio power plants, they don't matter in a global context. But the reality of the situation, that is not true. There is really no way that the USA can meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals unless Ohio reduces its own CO2 output. And it's very unlikely that other states are going to have to be able to make up for Ohio failing to reduce its own CO2 contribution. So that's a key point to keep in mind, is that reductions in Ohio are going to be crucial for the plan's success. Now, why particularly is this plan happening at this moment? Well, it's a few reasons. In 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that if the U.S. EPA found greenhouse gases to be harmful, pollutant, the Clean Air Act required the U.S. EPA to regulate them. Up to this point, the U.S. EPA, under the Bush administration, was refusing to even examine the potential impacts of greenhouse gases. Now, not surprisingly, the U.S. EPA did find greenhouse gases, including CO2, to be harmful. Therefore, the language of the Clean Air Act kicked in, and a bunch of regulations concerning greenhouse gases and CO2 have been issued recently. Some of those regulations are, say, the tailpipe emissions on cars, or new regulations on new and modified power plants. Now, the Clean Power Plan, we'll get into this in just a moment, but the Clean Power Plan applies to existing power plants, which are the biggest, by far, CO2 contributor, greenhouse gas emitters in the country. Now, sort of the Clean Air Act and the U.S. Supreme Court case tied into this following, tied into the failure of cap and trade legislation. Now, for those that don't know, and a reminder for those that do, in 2009 to 2010, the Senate, or the U.S. Congress, was considering whether to implement cap and trade legislation. Now, because that legislation in and of itself would have regulated greenhouse gas output, as part of that bill, that would have actually stripped the U.S. EPA's authority to regulate CO2. Now, if that bill had passed, we would have a cap and trade plan, so it wouldn't be the biggest deal in the world if the U.S. EPA didn't have the authority to regulate CO2. But it didn't pass. Therefore, that provision, the anti-U.S. EPA provision, did not go into effect. And so now we are here, right here. Now, after that fairly long windup, what precisely does the Clean Power Plan do? Well, despite all the details we're going to discuss, this next slide probably is the most important, this presentation. And specifically, the Clean Power Plan requires states to reduce CO2 from state-based power plants by an amount determined by the U.S. EPA. That's it. That's really all this plan is about. Like I said, we'll get into the details, but if this is the only thing you take away from this presentation, then you're already ahead of most people. So, well, a lot of people are saying, oh, this is going to turn off your electricity, you're going to be paying 200% more for your bills. The reality is it's obviously a lot less damaging and a lot less complicated than those people would say. So like I said, this plan, it just requires states to reduce CO2 from state-based power plants by an amount determined by the U.S. EPA. Now, precisely what are those amounts? For Ohio has to reduce its own carbon emission rate 28%. Now, each state has various levels of carbon reduction requirements, which we'll get into why in a moment, but all of those state reductions added up will lead to CO2 reductions equal to a 30% reduction from 2005 levels. Now, that's a lot more aggressive than was initially anticipated this plan would be. So this is really crucial, and this is part of the reason why this, just as it is right now, a proposed rule has been sort of so successful in spurring international action by China, by India, and by eventually likely the rest of the world, is that these are very aggressive reductions, and these will be very helpful into reducing the USA's overall greenhouse gas or CO2 output. So that's precisely what the rates are. Now, how are those rates calculated? This may be a little complicated, but as required by the Clean Air Act, which is what this regulation is being promulgated under, the EPA had to consider what cost-effective carbon reduction strategies are widely available for adoption by the states. After an exhaustive analysis, the U.S. EPA determined that a mix of the following actions are most effective at reducing greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions: using more renewable energy, becoming more energy efficient, using natural gas to replace coal, and making coal power plants more efficient. Now, the U.S. EPA presumed a certain amount of deployment for each action and applied those actions to the energy mix, energy capacity, and energy generation for each state, as those factors existed in 2012. So each state has a unique reduction rate because each state's energy mix, energy capacity, and energy generation is different. So for example, Washington has to reduce their CO2 emission rate by something like 70%, while Kentucky and North Dakota and I think, say, Maine don't have that much to do, maybe 15 to 17 or 18%. So Ohio's reductions are fairly substantial. Now, before I move on to discuss how Ohio can and should comply with the Clean Power Plan, are there any questions so far about anything that I have discussed, anything that I've said, anything that I haven't said? All right, I'm getting a question. Will the federal courts block the plan? Well, despite some, I do not believe they will. I believe there's a very long shot. There's the legal case, while many people are confident, including state officials. The reality of the situation is that this Clean Power Plan and what it's requiring states to do are largely within the confines of what the U.S. EPA can do and what the federal courts have ruled the U.S. EPA to do. So I do not believe that this will be blocked, though likely the opponents are well-funded, will be very aggressive, and do absolutely everything they can to ensure that the rule does not go into effect. But ultimately, I do not believe that the federal courts will, when it's all said and done, block the plan. Any other questions? If not, we're going to keep moving, but if you don't have something or you can't think of anything right now, just feel free to send it to me and we'll be stopping. Well, we're going to stop actually. I'll take questions in a moment. But now specifically, what does Ohio need to do when it comes to this plan? Well, specifically, despite how the U.S. EPA set the CO2 reduction rate, in complying with the rule, states are allowed to take any action in any amount that will reduce CO2 at power plants, and the U.S. EPA will accept that. The rule gives the states the flexibility to determine the best, most cost-effective options for compliance to reduce carbon pollution. So long as a state gets to the required level of carbon pollution reduction, the U.S. EPA does not care precisely how a state gets to the goal. The actions the U.S. EPA used to set the rate for Ohio, i.e. use a certain amount of energy efficiency, use a certain amount of renewable energy, use a certain amount of natural gas, the state does not have to exactly follow in complying with the rule. So for example, the rule presumes Ohio can deploy a certain amount or install a certain amount of renewable energy. But if Ohio wants to deploy more renewable energy than the U.S. EPA projects, the state can do so. Now, many people have been deliberately creating confusion by pretending the actions the U.S. EPA has used to set the rate or calculate the rate are precisely what states have to do to comply with the rate. But the reality is, while renewable energy and energy efficiency are obviously the best and most cost-effective ways to comply with the rule, and those are the ways that OEC certainly recommends state in Ohio and other states comply with the rule, any action which reduces carbon pollution at power plants will be allowed. Now, as far as what Ohio specifically will have to do, the Ohio EPA is the state agency that is sort of designated that has to submit the actual plan of demonstrating how Ohio reduces CO2 pollution output. The Ohio EPA will obviously put together a plan which uses strategies that are designed to reduce CO2 at existing standards. The U.S. EPA will either approve a state plan, which means those actions in this plan must be implemented, or it disapproves the plan. The U.S. EPA would likely only disapprove a plan if, for whatever reason, they didn't agree that some of the actions the Ohio EPA included in the plan would not actually make the required CO2 reductions that maybe Ohio presumes. So maybe there's some difference in opinion of that, and maybe they'll turn that plan down. Or maybe the U.S. Now, if that happens, if the U.S. EPA maybe does not agree with Ohio's plan, then the U.S. EPA has the authority to implement their own plan for Ohio, and therefore, will do essentially what they want to do to reduce Ohio's CO2 pollution output. The U.S. EPA is also empowered to install a plan referred to as a federal implementation plan if a state doesn't actually submit any plan whatsoever. Now, Ohio could also join with other states to jointly reduce each state's respective CO2 emissions, and likely could take advantage of the kind of efficiencies that are not available to a single state. So, for example, Ohio could join with Pennsylvania, with Michigan, with Indiana, with Kentucky, maybe even Hawaii if it wanted to, and sort of jointly reduce their own CO2 reductions. Now, at the moment, all Ohio EPA needs to do is to submit a plan to the U.S. EPA. But a variety of state legislatures, most recently Pennsylvania, are passing bills requiring their environmental agencies to have their state clean power plan approved by the legislature. It's important to note that regardless of what requirements state legislators place on their own respective clean power plan implementation plans, the U.S. EPA doesn't need state legislative approval. So if the U.S. EPA doesn't get a plan, whether it's because a plan was not submitted, or because it was not approved by a respective state's legislature, that doesn't matter. If the U.S. EPA doesn't get a plan, then they're going to install their own plan. Now, that was a fairly long digression by me. Does anyone have any questions about anything I just said? As I know someone has asked about a tentative date for implementation, I'm going to get to that in just a moment. That's actually the next slide. But as far as what Ohio needs to do, someone's asked, with the burning of more natural gas from fracking operations, there will be more methane leaked or emitted from the entire supply chain. From extraction to the burning in power plants. The amount of this methane, according to information I have read, is greater than recognized. US EPA is going to adopt methane regs for this methane from fracking this summer, but will it be enough to offset the overall greenhouse gas emissions from using natural gas in power plants? That's an excellent question, and it's likely that those emissions will, the regulations that are coming this summer will be substantial enough to offset the overall greenhouse, likely those regulations will take care of what is referred to as the leakage problem. For those that don't know, when extracting natural gas from fracking operations, or in general, specifically, certainly there likely along the way, along the extraction point, either during the well pad or transportation through pipelines, there can be specific leakage. And because methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas, that could offset the specific reductions in the Clean Power Plan, or at least it's been proposed that that could happen. But it's likely with future federal regulations that that'll likely take care of the problem. It should be also known that state regulations on this point aren't particularly that bad either. So that is an issue, and that's a very good question, but it's likely one that is being considered by the federal government. But it should be clear that it's technically outside of the scope of the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan will just applies to CO2 emissions. While methane is also a greenhouse gas, it is not the greenhouse gas that this rule will deal with. Is the Ohio, someone has also asked, is the Ohio legislature pushing the Ohio EPA for approval of the Ohio plan? Not at this moment, but ALEC, the conservative legislative organization, has been pushing various bills in various states that will require the legislature to approve the Ohio plan. That has not happened in Ohio yet, but we expect that it could happen in the future. So it is something we are keeping an eye on, and something that we will certainly fight if that happens. Are there any other questions so far? All right, moving on. Now, as far as the timeline is concerned, this is just a proposed rule. The final rule is going to be released sometime this summer. Initially, it was going to be released around late June, but the EPA has sort of essentially pushed back that timeline and says it will just release it sometime this summer in 2015. I believe that they'll likely release it sometime in August or possibly September. Now, once that happens, a state will have about a year to either submit a state plan, i.e. they'll have to submit a state plan by summer of 2016, or they can ask for an extension on developing their plan. If they ask for an extension, then states can submit a plan in summer of 2017. Now, to be very clear, the asking for an extension, that's not just some type of get-out-of-jail thing. The state has to demonstrate that they are in good faith developing a plan that eventually will be implemented. So they can't just say, call them up at the last moment and say, hey, we need some more time. They need to be able to say, we're doing this, 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 and we just need a little bit more time to do this aspect. So now if Ohio decides to join with another state, and they ask for an extension, then states can have until summer of 2018 to submit a joint plan. That sort of extra timeline was, the EPA allowed for that because they figured that if states are actually doing joint plans, various state legislatures will say need to probably approve certain aspects of that, i.e. joining with other states. So the EPA, in recognition of that, specifically said, okay, if you're joining with another state, you'll get more time. Well, now that we've gone through that, what are basically some of the benefits of this rule? Well, not surprisingly, there are many. In addition to preventing global warming, which is certainly no small thing, reducing carbon dioxide will also lead to reduction in pollutants which contribute to increased levels of asthma, heart attacks, heart disease, chronic and acute bronchitis, and emphysema. Depending on how various states' plans implement their various respective plans, that could lead to between 16 billion and 37 billion health benefits nationally. Climate benefits will come in the form of less extreme weather events, heat waves, days with temperatures above 95 degrees, and environmental disruption. And likely that will amount to up to 17 billion in national monetary benefits. Furthermore, some of the actions the US EPA have essentially recommended the state pursue have already had substantial economic benefits for Ohio. Energy efficiency measures in the past from SB 221 have saved Ohioans over $1 billion. Furthermore, 25,000 jobs in Ohio are tied to the clean energy. So we know, because of the actions Ohio has taken in the past, that if it decides to really aggressively comply with the rule with cost-effective measures like renewable energy and energy efficiency, it'll not only make Ohio's electricity sector cleaner, it'll benefit Ohio economically. Now, what is OEC doing with this rule? Well, we've been very involved with this rule. We've been meeting with state officials to help them understand the importance of renewable energy and energy efficiency. We have submitted technical comments demonstrating Ohio's ability to comply with the Clean Power Plan. We're also working with other environmental organizations to maximize our strength and influence on the Clean Power Plan. And certainly with all of your support, we'll continue to do that over the next few months and the next few years. I'm about to wrap up, but I do want to say a couple of final thoughts on this specifically. While changes will likely be made to the rule to make it more politically appealing and to protect it against court challenges, I do think the basic strength of the plan will likely not change. I do not think it's likely that the overall national reduction number, the 30% CO2 reductions below 2005, will change. Though US EPA may slightly tweak how they calculate the state rates, which could lead to a situation where Ohio's rate is actually lowered, but other states that currently have low CO2 reduction rates, like Kentucky or North Dakota, will then have higher CO2 reduction rates. Overall, while there will be a lot of sound and fury when the final rule is released, if you want to understand how strong the final rule truly is, keep an eye on that national rate. If it stays the same or is increased, great. If it's lowered, then not so great. I know a few questions have already been submitted, so I'm going to start answering them right now. Someone's asking, does Ohio have a least cost way to meet the regulations, or is that a decision that is yet to be made? Well, Ohio administrative officials have not yet totally decided on what their plan would be. OEC has submitted technical information and policy studies which demonstrate that renewable energy and energy efficiency are the least cost ways to meet the regulations. And furthermore, they'll also have economic benefits to Ohioans. Ohioans will save money. Ohioans will get jobs, either doing energy efficiency installations or renewable or wind energy jobs or solar energy jobs. So as far as least cost methods, while no one has officially decided on the Ohio's compliance methods, renewable energy and energy efficiency are the best ways to go. All right, I have a question here. PUCO and Ohio EPA have both immediately pushed back in early December that they don't think Ohio can comply or can't afford to comply with the proposed rule. What leverage can OEC and citizens apply to force OEP and PUCO to stop foot-dragging on this rule? Well, certainly both of those organizations have indicated to the U.S. EPA that they do not think Ohio can comply with the rule. The reality is they are making efforts at least to initially put together a plan on the rule. But as far as what leverage OEC and citizens yourself can apply, well, I'd certainly continue to stay engaged with the OEC. We will be on top of this as soon as the final rule is announced and over the next few years. So we will definitely, and we're also, like I said, working with other Ohio environmental organizations like Sierra Club, like NRDC, like EDF, to ensure that we have a maximum amount of influence on the plan. So as far as what can you do to ensure we're as strong as possible, well, keep supporting OEC as you have been supporting in the past. And as I say, I thank you very much to everyone to all of you. I have a question here that says, if natural gas rates become very low, will this reduce the efforts to envision and adopt energy efficiency and renewables? Some say this will be a rather adverse effect of viewing natural gas as a bridge fuel away from coal. Also, as more natural gas infrastructure is built, will it be more difficult to ever wean ourselves from it as a bridge fuel? Well, even if natural gas rates become very low, as they are right now, they do fluctuate. And many people at PUCO and EPA understand that. That's why energy efficiency and renewable energy are always going to be a great or a good technology to adopt, because obviously it doesn't cost us anything to get it doesn't cost, sun doesn't cost us any energy, the wind doesn't cost us anything. Well, it costs money to build solar energy and energy efficiency. Obviously, fuel from the sun or wind does not cost anything, it does not fluctuate. Now, it's true that there could be a problem with if we get overly reliant on gas, that could cut into the type of energy efficiency and investments we could make. And that's something to definitely keep an eye on, but I will say that likely, because energy efficiency is the cheapest and renewable energy are by far the cheapest way to comply with the Clean Power Plan, I do see those two actions being a part of Ohio's plan to reduce CO2 and comply with the Clean Power Plan. Can we get a copy of the OEC submitted analysis of the Clean Power Plan to the U.S. EPA? It's currently on our website right now, specifically, but we'll be able to send it out to you afterwards. There's also a question, is there an Ohio public proceeding on how the plan is to be drafted? That's an excellent question. At this moment, there is not a public proceeding so far. In other words, is there a public record on this matter? That's it. At this point, not yet, but likely when the rule is finalized, I presume the U.S. EPA or Ohio EPA or PUCO will likely announce some type of public process to maybe taking comments on precisely how Ohio can comply with the plan. That's all the questions I have. That's all the questions that have certainly been presented so far. Are there any other questions whatsoever on anything that I've stated, anything that I haven't stated? How does transportation factor in? Well, because specifically this is just applying to 111D, because this is just applying to electricity generating plants. Transportation actually doesn't factor into this plan. It would have factored into a cap and trade plan, but this just applies to emissions from CO2 power plants. And since transportation, cleaner cars, well, certainly OEC supports those in general, they will not play a part of it because they will not help reduce emissions from electricity generating plants. Someone's pointed out that the Ohio EPA is still accepting comments on the proposed rule, and the email address for those comments are 111D rule comments at epa.ohio.gov. So once again, that is 111D rule, R-U-L-E, comments, C-O-M-M-E-N-T-S, at epa.ohio.gov. Are there stakeholder meetings where OEC's policies are discussed, vetted? Specifically, we're always working with other organizations and taking feedback from our own members. So we're always vetting and discussing our policies internally and externally with other organizations. But certainly, if you have any questions or concerns about any of the policies we've discussed, you certainly are feel free to send those along. We have a place on our website where you can submit any questions or comments to the OEC specifically. Second part. All right. There's also a question about natural gas specifically being used as a bridge fuel. Well, certainly it is. If we wanted to reduce CO2, it could, in theory, likely be used as a bridge fuel. But ideally, as far as the Clean Power Plan is concerned, just referring to this, I likely think there will be mostly energy efficiency and renewable energy will be used to comply with the plan just because it is cheaper overall and less volatile than natural gas. But yes, natural gas has been used as, or at least is referred to as, a bridge fuel, as a way to get off coal, which is much, much dirtier than natural gas, but not necessarily go totally to renewable energy if there isn't the capacity to offset those coal emission reductions. Someone is asking, how does the federal Clean Power Plan run contrary to Bill Seitz's push to roll back renewables in Ohio? That's referring to 310. Now, just this past summer, Ohio, while we had energy efficiency and renewable energy standards, they were frozen by a push from Bill Seitz and First Energy and other organizations. So how does Bill Seitz's role to push back renewables? Well, it hurts us, frankly. The more emissions reductions we can make now, the more solar energy installations we can install, the more wind energy turbines we can put up, the less we'll have to do later. So this really has hurt Ohio and its ability to comply with the Clean Power Plan. But hopefully everyone in Ohio realizes that renewable energy and energy efficiency standards are the best way to go, and then we end up hopefully reinstalling those standards. Currently, those standards are technically frozen. While it's certainly possible that they can go away, ideally those standards will be implemented back in 2017, which is when they are currently scheduled to go back into effect. Are there any other questions so far? Any other questions at all? Is natural gas and renewable energy cheap enough that it can replace coal economically? Yes, I believe so. Renewable energy has prices, especially solar energy and wind energy too, have been dropping dramatically over the past few years. And natural gas right now has always been a fairly, or at least very recently, prices have dropped dramatically. But certainly the problem is that likely natural gas prices can rise, and they likely will as people start using more natural gas, more demand, more prices. But renewable energy, it will likely continue to get cheap, and it will likely be cheap enough very soon we'll be able to compete against coal on a one-to-one basis, essentially. Someone has asked, are Bill cites, are the Energy Mandate Study Committee, are they involved in clean power planning? Well, they are examining the Clean Power Plan in the context of how it affects the Ohio Energy Mandate Study Committee and the Ohio Energy Mandate Study Committee to do what they want to do with the renewable energy and energy efficiency standards. They're not technically involved in the actual development of a plan for Ohio compliance, though their decision could greatly affect Ohio's compliance with the Clean Power Plan. All right, I'm only going to take about one or two more questions. Are there any others so far? Seeing none. Now, well, we're about to end the webinar. Certainly, if you have any more questions, feel free to send them in. How can I get more involved in this? Certainly at this moment, the Clean Power Plan, certainly if you would, you could always contact your legislature and let them know how you feel about this, how you feel that you think Ohio should use renewable energy and energy efficiency, but also to essentially stay engaged with the OEC. We'll be engaging with state officials, we'll be engaging with state legislatures in the actual development of the plan. All right, even though, if you do have any further questions, feel free to email me at bhowell, that's BHOWELL, at theoec.org. Once again, that's bhowell, BHOWELL, at theoec.org. Well, if there are no other questions, this has been very enjoyable. Thank you for joining with me today. Certainly, if you missed anything, we'll be posting this on our website, so you can always review it any day and rewatch it at any hour, at any day, at any time in the future. Thank you for joining us. As I said, my name is Brennan Howell. My colleague Hannah Tyler is here. Thank you for being with us today.